12 days of war, planes firing bombs at Iran, ballistic missiles flying toward Israel. But those 12 days were actually the climax of much more when alliances were put to the test. Certain failures and victories in this war were the result of a much broader struggle in the fiery chess game between Israel and Iran. The war between Israel and Iran continued, with fighter jets dropping bombs and missiles from one side and the other using their ballistic and hypersonic missiles. Buildings exploded in Israel, most of them civilian targets hit by Iran's high-tech weapons. It was clear that Tehran's forces had enough technology to get past air defenses like the Iron Dome. And that was not a simple battle against rockets and drones launched by forces like Hamas and Hezbollah. Those two groups, by the way, were an unknown factor at the time. Both remained active, but, along with Houthis, they were part of the Axis of Resistance, the group of forces backed by Iran with money, weapons, and technology. However, what these three lacked was some more decisive action in their support for their patron and financier state. It was a question that would be asked during the 12 days of war, and that deserved a deeper analysis. Meanwhile, shortly before the end of the war, the Israelis sent more of their planes to drop new bombs against the forces of Tehran. Targets were tracked by attack drones. The Hermes 900 could launch spike missiles from more than 10 kilometers away. The impact on Iranian forces cost more than $250,000, but it wiped out one of the enemy operations. In just one day, Israel claimed to have destroyed 12 Iranian missile launch bases. The widespread explosions made it clear that many of these were not just simple decoys. The Israelis' ability to fly inside Iran and eliminate these targets was frightening. Apparently, there were also special forces from Tel Aviv still inside the country carrying out some of these attacks on the ground or simply identifying the location of some targets. The Israel Defense Forces even put 60 aircraft into enemy airspace to destroy sites from which the missiles were launched. Many of these passed through Syrian airspace, where there was still a strong Russian presence. Despite Bashar al-Assad's defeat, the Russians, allies of the Iranians, did nothing. There were rumors that their satellites and other equipment passed intelligence to the Iranians. But even so, the explosions of Tehran's equipment continued. Iranian air defenses had to work hard to contain so many threats, often failing terribly to defend their assets. The Iranian Kohanshah 4 missiles, or K-bar, made more of their flights against Israel. That was a 13-meter-long project weighing 19 tons. Each of them would fly 2,000 kilometers to explode almost 2 tons of explosives in Israel. They would be more direct hits against the cities, many of which would not be intercepted by air defenses. Tel Aviv suffered from the Iranian attacks. More and more doubts arose about Israel's ability to withstand so many missiles. The salvos of various projectiles, including swarms of drones, kept coming one after another toward Israel. The Sedir hypersonic missile, weighing 22 tons and capable of hitting its target with an accuracy of 50 meters, marked the skies of Iran as it headed toward Israel. It ended up being intercepted, causing only minor damage to a car. But other projectiles fell again in Haifa in northern Israel. The Lebanese watched, trying to imagine if Hezbollah would try something like just over a year ago when it caused the displacement of thousands of Israelis with its attacks. However, the Lebanese missiles were absent from the war. It wasn't easy to stop so many weapons specialized in piercing defenses studied by scientists in Tehran for both sides. Both sides had studied and prepared themselves to strike each other. In that interval, the American bombers had already flown under Trump's orders and were approaching what would become the legendary attack on the Iranian nuclear bases. The pressure from the Israelis for the Americans to use their bunker-busting bombs was increasing every day. Meanwhile, the missile launchers in Tehran continued to be hunted. The true capability of Iran to have equipment and teams prepared for these launches was unknown. But the amount of them destroyed showed that Israel was hitting the right targets, since the Iranians had no other weapon to launch against their enemies. Tehran Air Force planes were wiped out on the ground. Israeli jets flew freely over Tabriz, in the north of the enemy country, probably after passing through Iraq, where Iran-backed militias could do nothing or simply chose not to act, at least not at a level that mattered in this war. Their action was to watch more scenes of equipment destruction. The military targets inside Iran suffered more and more. The rising columns of smoke were proof that bombs were falling frequently. The explosions in Yazd in central eastern Iran, almost 2,000 kilometers inside enemy territory, showed Tel Aviv's ability to enter what should be an extremely well-defended airspace given the climate of tension and war in the Middle East. Bushehr, near the Persian Gulf and where there was a nuclear power facility, also burned under attack. American bombs fell on Fordo, with B-2 Spirit planes flying freely over Iran and then leaving without any sign of interference from air defenses. Even with questionable results, they would later land in columns in their homeland. Talks about a ceasefire increased with threats from the Trump administration about new bombings. The American president also intensified diplomatic efforts. He spoke with Vladimir Putin, and both agreed that despite their differences over the origins of the conflict, the war between Israel and Iran needed to come to an end. The dialogue included likely signals for the resumption of nuclear negotiations at a future time. Israel still had important targets, such as a base of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in Yazid. Other bases were attacked in different regions, with rumors of many soldiers killed. Aerial images showed the destruction of one of these sites, indicating that there may really have been casualties. Iranian air defenses managed to stop some enemy drones. Their downing was impressive, but the Israeli jets were still targets that eluded military capabilities. The number of missiles flying against Israel decreased a bit, perhaps due to ceasefire negotiations. For the first time, one of the images from the ballistic missile cameras was shown. Abbas Aragid, Iran's Minister of Foreign Affairs, traveled to Russia to talk with Putin. He received great support with words like, "We are trying to help the Iranian people. Please convey my best wishes to the President and the Supreme Leader of Iran." The attack to retaliate against the American bombings was carried out shortly after the bombs had fallen on Iranian territory. The target was the Al Qudain base in Qatar, which houses about 10,000 military personnel and has served as the regional operations headquarters since 1996. Iran used short and medium-range ballistic missiles, which it claimed was a powerful and devastating attack against its aggressors. Light shone in the sky over Qatar, rising from interception systems like the American Patriot. The beautiful flashes in the sky and the celebrations on the ground made people forget the violence of the collisions in the air. Iran claimed that 6 missiles hit the target. Qatar and the United States reported a total of 14 to 19 missiles launched, of which 13 were intercepted and 1 landed outside the base without causing any damage. Later, it was learned that the only devastating thing was the disappointment of those who expected something more. Iran reportedly informed Qatar and the United States a few hours before the attack, allowing for preparation and the preventive evacuation of troops and aircraft. There were no casualties, there was no damage. It was just good propaganda for Iranian television and a very expensive fireworks show in the skies over Qatar. Of course, the same can't be said for Israel, which came under Iranian fire and saw the explosions unfold before their eyes. There were areas where thick smoke left citizens increasingly frightened after watching more defenses fail and fearing rumors that the Iron Dome could be depleted. One of the projectiles landed in Beersheba, in southern Israel. The Iranians said the target was the nearby Israel Defense Forces Intelligence Headquarters and the Gavian Technology Park. But it was the nearby hospital that was hit, with approximately 71 people injured at the hospital and about 80 in total in the city, as well as 4 dead. And that was when high-precision missiles were used. It was a direct hit that left a mark on the city, not just because of the blood that was shed, but with a concrete scar that reminded Israelis of the cost of that war. Perhaps the damage from the attacks in the south could have been greater if Hamas was still firing as many projectiles at the Israelis as it did 2 years earlier. The war seemed close to ending, but the planes were flying in one direction and the ballistic missiles in the other. The Iranians suffered a blow that bled the Basij forces, a paramilitary group that made up one of the 5 branches of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The attack buried yet another Iranian commander. Israel continued with new precise strikes against Iranian assets. Just as they defended themselves by destroying drones that flew into their territory, the Iranians celebrated the downing of another Israeli reconnaissance drone, Aeron. They also claimed to have shot down others using electronic interference, but it was a fact that both sides were already worn out by the conflict. The pressure from the Americans for a ceasefire increased. On the morning of June 23rd, shortly before the ceasefire took effect, Iran launched another round of missiles, possibly as a final show of strength, seeking not to come empty-handed to the negotiations. In total, 15 missiles were fired in succession at targets in Israel. There were accusations of violations from both sides, with even the Iranians commenting that they were not aware of these ceasefire negotiations. But in the end, after 12 days, the war came to an end. Both sides declared victory. In fact, as the matter was analyzed, each of the two sides could have been victorious in some way, depending on the interpretation. The United States, with the typical pomp of Donald Trump, boasted about the methyl spirit attacks, but as the days went by, the story changed and the damage assessments decreased to the point of being questioned within the country itself. It was reported that it was very likely that the Iranian nuclear program would continue and that, in fact, the negotiations had taken many steps back. Despite what may be considered a failure in that sense, American planes entered and left Iranian territory in columns, dropping bombs as if they were just taking a trip through their own backyard. They received back only a weak attack on one of their bases. The Iranians considered themselves the great victors of the war, claiming to have resisted the Israelis and Americans. They reported shooting down Israeli jets and capturing pilots, and also having arrested Mossad agents, but without confirmations or evidence. Images of downed Israeli drones did exist. Tel Aviv confirmed that 2 Aeron drones were lost. However, apart from that, the Iranians lost more than 20, some say 30 high-ranking officers, possibly totaling up to 60 important figures, including scientists. Weaker minds even commented that this is normal in a war and that they were replaced. But we have to question the blood alcohol level of anyone who claims it's normal to lose so many in 12 days of war during an operation inside their own territory, which would result in 12 days of almost total loss of superiority in their own airspace. Iran's Ministry of Interior officially reported that there were about 610 dead and 4,700 wounded on Iranian territory due to Israeli bombings. Unfortunately, that number includes civilians and children. Israel considered itself victorious for being a country 70 times smaller than Iran, and yet having carried out such a successful secret operation that allowed it to almost dominate enemy airspace and still withstand so many attacks. Tel Aviv claimed to have destroyed more than 200 Iranian ballistic missile launchers, including mobile platforms and fixed silos during its offensives. It also declared to have neutralized at least 120 anti-aircraft missile systems belonging to Iran. In the air sector, the country claimed the destruction of 8 attack helicopters, 1 attack helicopters, 5 F-14 Tomcat fighter jets, 2 F-5 fighter jets from the Iranian Air Force, and 1 KC-707 refueling aircraft while it was still on the ground. This was in addition to the bloody blow against the top of the Iranian military and scientific leadership. Equipment can be paid for and replaced, but mines are not so easily replaced. No high-ranking Israeli military officer was even injured during these 12 days. What Iran achieved in Israel was 29 deaths, most of them civilians hit by missiles and drones, and approximately 3,238 injured. Among the injured, there were hundreds with trauma or burns, as well as thousands who needed care for shock and anxiety attacks. And this had more impact than one might expect. The invincibility of the Iron Dome was put to the test, and the effects were used as propaganda. The destruction of so many civilian structures generated a feeling of satisfaction and a desire for revenge, showing the Israelis what their bombings had done in Gaza and Lebanon. About 3,800 Israelis were forced to leave their homes temporarily, mainly residents of border areas in the north and people living in damaged buildings in urban centers. More than 8,000 people were completely displaced, with their homes reduced to rubble by the attacks. The Israelis said that between 80 and 90% of the more than 1,500 missiles and drones were intercepted, with 31 impacts in populated areas, mostly residential. Those that fell showed very clearly what 2 tons of explosives were capable of doing. Other sources, such as Al Jazeera, reported that there were about 120 impacts. Despite some discrepancies, there were similar numbers when checking the final statistics regarding the number of interceptions. It is worth noting that at a certain point, Israeli defenses dropped to about 65% in the number of interceptions due to new Iranian strategies. Some reports indicate that later, the number of interceptions increased again. Narrower minds might even say that this was a total defeat for Iran, but no. Maybe those minds didn't understand the reality of what that symbol of destruction meant. This was an eternal mark of blood within Israel. The lion was bled, and this alerted all its enemies to the possibility of defeating it. The Iranians celebrated based on their resistance and what their missiles could do to Israel. Furthermore, if there was an intention to overthrow the Tehran regime, it must be said that Israel and the United States failed shamefully in this. But there was a certain defeat that the Iranians refused to acknowledge, something that few understood or commented on when summarizing that war in 12 days. Hamas is a Palestinian political and military organization with a Sunni Islamic orientation that governs the Gaza Strip and also has a presence in the West Bank. Its rise to power has a long and complex history involving a series of political issues. Iran has for years provided Hamas with weapons, military training, and technology, including missiles and drones. When Hamas carried out the bloody terrorist attack on October 7, 2023, killing more than 1,000 Israelis, most of them civilians, including children, there apparently was no full coordination with Iran. Many expected the group to be supported by Hezbollah in the north and to have more decisive support from Iran. None of that happened. and only a few groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad took part in the defense against the Israeli offensive triggered by the terrorist attack. The war in Gaza went very badly for Hamas. Their celebrations were based on the occasional deaths of Israeli soldiers, while their group had its leadership decimated, culminating in the death in October 2024 of their main leader, Yahya Sinwar. In addition, Hamas saw the loss of thousands of civilian lives from a population it was supposed to protect. The bombings by Israel generated international outcry and diplomatic isolation for the country, but did not affect the fate of Hamas. When the war between Israel and Iran began, Hamas had almost no capacity left to operate outside of Gaza. It lost much of its territory to the Israelis. And its main claim of victory was the fact that there were casualties among the Israelis and its own continued existence in a destroyed Gaza. Some even pointed out that Hamas intensified its attacks during the 12-day war. But the biggest news from that time is about an ambush in which 7 Israeli soldiers were killed. Not even news about the rocket attacks, which occurred in large numbers at the beginning of the conflict between Hamas and Israel, made headlines. Something that could have helped to further saturate the Israeli defenses. What Hamas did most effectively was to launch large messages of condemnation on the internet. Hezbollah, a Lebanese Shia organization with political and paramilitary activities, maintains one of the longest-lasting and most strategic alliances with Iran in the Middle East. This relationship, shaped by ideological, military, and religious ties, is much deeper and more integrated than the connection between Tehran and Hamas, which is more pragmatic and circumstantial. While Hamas was facing isolation and intense military pressure in Gaza, Hezbollah limited itself to specific actions in northern Israel, without causing enough impact to divert the focus of Israel's defense forces from the Palestinian territory. Even so, Hezbollah carried out sporadic attacks in response to the Israeli offensive in Gaza, claiming that it would maintain its campaign until the bombing stopped. The escalation forced about 96,000 people to leave their homes in Israel and caused the displacement of approximately 1 million Lebanese. Even with the increase in tensions, the group did not significantly expand its direct military involvement in the conflict. The Israeli response was patient but devastating. Starting in September 2024, precision strikes began that neutralized Hezbollah fighters, with a legendary operation involving explosive pages followed by continuous bombings that eliminated several of their commanders. Eventually, the attacks reached Hassan Nasrallah himself, the leader of the group. The offensive left a trail of destruction, with around 4,000 dead in Lebanon, including civilians and fighters, southern villages in the country devastated, and Shiite neighborhoods in Beirut severely hit. With the imposition of a ceasefire, Hezbollah was weakened and Lebanon was devastated. The Lebanese reaction to the Iranian offensive, when Tehran launched missiles against Israel, was limited to demonstrations of support and celebration, without any real intention of Hezbollah military actions. The main contribution of the group was to maintain a constant threat on Israel's northern border, forcing the country to keep large military contingents in the region, which imposed continuous logistical and strategic pressure all the way to Lviv. Other than that, at no time did they take the opportunity to saturate the enemy countries north with their attacks, something they had been doing for so many years. The Houthis, an insurgent movement from Yemen strongly supported by Iran, had just sealed a truce with the United States when the 12 Days War began. This alliance against Iran has existed for a long time. Iran has been their main patron, providing advanced weaponry such as ballistic missiles and long-range drones, as well as technical and military training. In June 2025, the main move by the Houthis was a strategic shift. They temporarily abandoned the ceasefire to take an offensive stance. Israel remained under threat, ready to be attacked if the conflict escalated. However, the group's active participation was brief. On the 13th, right at the beginning of the conflict, the Huts launched a missile that tragically ended up hitting a Palestinian village. After this serious mistake, no other offensive came from the group. The initial action was followed by military silence, marking their performance as limited and ineffective throughout the rest of the conflict. During the month of June 2025, the pro-Iranian Shiite militias operating in Iraq and Syria adopted a notably restrained and coordinated stance in response to the escalation of the conflict between Israel and Iran. In Iraq, groups such as Kataib Hezbollah, Asaib al-Haq, and Arakat al-Nujaba all formally integrated into the Popular Mobilization Forces, but with clear ties of loyalty to Tehran, avoided direct confrontations with American or Israeli targets. According to analysts from the Washington Institute, this inactivity may have been strategic. The militias were kept on standby as a reserve force, to be activated only if the United States became directly involved in the war. In Syria, the caution was similar. Shiite and foreign units, such as the Afghan Fatemiyun brigades and the Iraqi contingents of Haqqat al-Nujaba deployed in regions like Aleppo and Deir el-Zor, also did not carry out offensive actions against Israel. The absence of retaliation may have been the result of geographical limitations or orders from higher up that prioritized containment. Even so, during the conflict, some rockets were fired from southern Syria toward Israeli territory. Although responsibility for the attacks was not officially claimed, Tel Aviv attributed the launches to Palestinian cells or Shiite militants operating under Iranian influence. The projectiles did not cause any casualties as they were intercepted or fell in uninhabited areas. In response, Israel carried out targeted airstrikes against facilities used by Iran in Syrian territory, with a focus on bombings in the Kizua region on the outskirts of Damascus. In June 2025, Iran's relations with Russia and China proved to be a consolidated strategic alliance, the result of years of growing cooperation in diplomatic, economic, and military areas. The crisis served to highlight the contours of this three-way partnership supported by long-term agreements. Since 2021, Tehran and Beijing have been linked by a comprehensive 25-year cooperation agreement, which involves large-scale Chinese investments in Iran's energy and infrastructure sectors, as well as a gradual strengthening of military ties between the two countries. In the military field, Iran has maintained a symbiotic relationship with Moscow. During the war in Ukraine, Tehran provided technology and logistical support, including Shahed drones. However, by that time, the equipment was already mostly manufactured on Russian territory. In the context of the war with Israel, both Russia and China adopted diplomatic positions favorable to Iran, although with different degrees of emphasis. The Russian President Vladimir Putin took an active role in the political negotiations. He held individual phone conversations with the Iranian president and the Israeli prime minister. In these conversations, he expressed strong condemnation of the Israeli attacks and even offered to act as a mediator between the two sides. There was even information circulating that Russian diplomats discreetly sounded out possible ceasefire terms with Israel. It's important to remember that Moscow exerts considerable influence over Syrian airspace. During the conflict, reports indicate that Russia passively allowed Israeli bombings against Iranian targets on Syrian soil without intervening. Israeli fighter jets crossed Syrian territory toward Iran, apparently without Russian opposition. It is said that Israeli forces landed or passed through Syrian territory before entering Iran. This happened without any warning from the Russians to the Iranians. With its extensive network of satellites and radars in the region, there are indications that Russia shared valuable information with Iran about Israeli military movements, contributing to Iran's defensive capability. However, this can be questioned by the initial success of the Israeli attack. China, in turn, adopted a more restrained rhetoric but was equally critical of Israel's stance. Beijing condemned any escalation of the conflict and reiterated its opposition to actions that increase regional instability. Despite its moderate rhetoric, China maintained its commercial relations with Tehran, continuing to purchase Iranian oil and provide sensitive technologies to the regime. It is important to understand that nothing in geopolitics is permanent, much less the word of great powers regarding their smaller allies. The fact that Russia and China have not provided direct military aid to Iran does not mean that they won't do so in the future, nor that their diplomatic support hasn't been important. But it is a fact that both have seen their Iranian allies dismantled in recent years. They did little. The 12-day war was simply the climax of a 3-year campaign. Hamas and Hezbollah have become shadows of the power they once were when they gathered enough strength to threaten the Israelis. The Russians watched from their planes as Syrian power collapsed in just a few days. In the end, no matter how much Iran talks about resistance and claims victory, its losses are not limited to just 12 days, but everything it invested over the years. All the troops it trained, equipment it smuggled, and leaders it developed, all to be buried by Israeli bombings. It's a strategic issue. At the end of the 12 days, the Israelis had not only killed dozens of high-ranking Iranian military personnel and scientists and destroyed so much equipment, but also demoralized Iranian intelligence. During those 12 days, Tel Aviv showed that by bombing Iran, the core of the resistance, no one was able to respond. Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, Iraqis, Syrians all remained silent in the face of the massive bombing of the leader of the axis of resistance. And when the Israelis called, the Americans came. The Russians didn't even threaten Israel's jets in Syria. From that, you can understand the level of stupidity of those who say that Iran simply won. But I said there was also another idiot, the one who denied the intensity of the images of Israeli cities burning destroyed buildings. You can't deny the impact of that. It's a symbol, and propaganda symbols can become immortal, igniting fearful hearts with courage. Of course, if Holtz, Hamas, and Hezbollah had launched their missiles and rockets like so many other times, the damage could have been greater. That was Israel's most vulnerable moment in decades. Yes, there could have been more, but what happened was enough to generate part of what the Iranians needed. Finally, I need to talk about one more kind of fool, one that can be on both sides. When the Israelis bombed Gaza, killing civilians, there were those who said that punishing a people collectively for the mistakes of their leaders was a crime. They were right, because the civilians killed for what the Hamas terrorists did was not justifiable. But these same people celebrated by making jokes about fireworks in Israel and applauding the civilian targets hit by Iran's ballistic missiles without caring about people of all ages who were killed or maimed. The Iranian targets were clearly against civilians. They have high-precision missiles. The military areas and the Israeli military uniforms were always there. Even so, state-of-the-art missiles made a point of intentionally targeting civilians. And not so many died only because of an effective air force from a country that protected its population. Obviously, this kind of idiot exists on both sides, since there are those who think that every Palestinian deserves the punishment of a Hamas terrorist. The first two types of idiots I mentioned can even be convinced with numbers or with the aftermath of events. But this last one is more complicated. This last one can only be convinced if he learns to be human and to have empathy. And these are characteristics that can often simply be absent, having been killed by something called ideology.